Della Roundtree unlocked the meeting house door every Sunday for 3 years, the way she had the morning they raised it. She turned the key. She swept the sill. She lit the stove in winter. And on the Sunday I want to tell you about, a hand went out in front of the whole congregation and pointed her 2 children, Amos and Ludie, to the back bench. She did not raise her voice. She did not sit down. The trustee's name was Alvah Prewitt. He stood at the front, and he said it plain. The front pews are for the families that built this church. 40 members watched the hands go up. The vote carried, 22-19. And what none of the 40 had ever thought to ask was whose name was written at the land office in Kirwin, whose key hung at Della's waist. They cut the meeting short before anyone thought to ask it. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we go on, do one thing for me. Subscribe, so this story finds the next person who needs it. And in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is where the truth was buried. It was 1879 when Della Roundtree came up the North Fork of the Solomon River. She came in a wagon that was not hers to start with, in a train of families who called themselves exodusters, freed people leaving the old ground of West Tennessee for land a man could own. Kansas was the word passed hand to hand in those years. Kansas, where the government would give a person a quarter section if that person could live on it and work it. She had heard the word in a cotton row. She carried it 3 states west. She was not young when she came. She was not old. She had 2 children and a way of standing that made men take off their hats without quite knowing why. Graham County, in that year, was mostly grass. The Nicodemus colony had already set its stakes to the west, black families making a town out of sod and nerve. Della did not stop at Nicodemus. She went a little farther, to a bend in the river where the grass ran high and no one had filed, and she stood in it a while. And she decided. She went to the land office at Kirwin. That was a long ride, and a longer wait in the line, and a clerk who looked at her twice before he wrote. But the law did not care what the clerk thought. The law said a person of age could enter a homestead, and Della was a person of age. She put her name to the entry for 160 acres. Della Roundtree. The clerk wrote it in the book and stamped it, and that stamp did not know the color of her hand. That is the thing about a record. It only knows what it says. She built a soddy first, the way everyone did, cutting the prairie into bricks and stacking them into walls. She broke the sod with a borrowed plow and planted what she could. Amos was 8 then. Ludie was 5. They learned the work the way children of that country learned it, with their hands, before they were tall enough to reach the plow handles. And in the evenings, when the light went long and gold across the grass, Della would sit in the door of the soddy and think about what the settlement did not have. It did not have a school. It did not have a church. There were families scattered up and down that fork of the river now, black and white both, homesteaders who had come the same hungry way she had, and their children were growing up with no letters and no Sunday. Some of them had come far enough that they had learned to read the word Kansas, but not much past it. That sat wrong with Della. A settlement with no place to gather is not a settlement. It is just people who happen to be near each other. So she took a piece of paper. She wrote at the top of it what she wanted, in her own hand, careful, the letters even. A building. One building, to serve 2 purposes. A schoolhouse on the weekdays for the children, a meeting house on Sundays for anyone who would come. She named the place Fair Prospect, because that is what the bend in the river looked like to her the first day she stood in it. And she carried that paper door to door. You have to picture what that meant. There were no roads worth the name. There were tracks in the grass. She walked them. She went to the soddies and the half-built frame houses and the dugouts cut into the riverbank, and she stood in the doorways and she said her piece. Some gave cash. Most had no cash. So she wrote down what they had. A man who would give 3 days of labor. A woman who would give the nails she had saved from a broken wagon. A family who would give a team and a chain to haul the lumber up from the rail. She wrote it all down, every name, every pledge. 41 names. When she was done, 41 names stood on that paper. Cash and pledged labor together came to $612, which in that country and that year was a fortune made out of almost nothing. And of those 41 names, some belonged to families who would later sit in that building and forget entirely that they had signed. That is the part you want to hold on to. 41 names. Remember the number. Now there was one thing more. A meeting house wants a bell. You cannot call people across 2 miles of grass with your voice. You need a bell that carries. And bells cost money and cost more to freight. But Della had set aside a little from the subscription for exactly this, and she sent for one, and it came up from Leavenworth by rail and then by wagon, a bell that weighed 60 pounds, cast iron with a good deep throat to it. She paid the freight on that bell herself, out of the paper she had carried, and she wrote that down too. The freight on the bell. It is in the list. It matters later more than you would think. They raised the building on the rise of her own claim. There is a reason for that, and it is a plain one. Every other piece of ground thereabouts was somebody's homestead that they meant to prove up and keep, and no one wanted to give a corner of it away for good. But Della offered a corner of hers, free, on the high ground where the water would not stand, where a bell in the gable would carry farthest. Hers was the ground offered free. So hers was the ground they built on. The frame building of the Fair Prospect settlement, district and church both, went up on a rise of the Roundtree quarter section, and the men who nailed it together did not think twice about whose grass it stood in. Why would they? She had asked them there. It went up in a week of long days. The whole subscription came out to swing hammers and carry water and feed the crews. Amos, 9 by then, carried nails in a bucket until his arms shook. Ludie, 6, carried water in a dipper and spilled half of it and was praised for the half she saved. When the frame was up and the roof was on and the bell was hung in the gable, they stood back and looked at it, this one white building on the green rise, and more than one of them wept, because they had made a thing that would outlast them, together, out of nothing but a paper and a woman's walking. Della climbed up herself and rang the bell the first time. She said later she wanted to know the sound before anyone else did. It rang out across the fork of the river, and the families on their claims stopped what they were doing and listened, and some of them cried too, hearing it, because it meant they were somewhere now. It meant Fair Prospect was a place. A bell will do that. It tells you that you are inside of something. And then, the ordinary years began. The good ones. The ones nobody tells stories about, because nothing goes wrong in them. 6 days a week the building was a school. A teacher came, boarded around among the families, taught the children their letters and their numbers off a few worn books. Amos turned out quick with figures. Ludie turned out quick with words, and would read aloud to the little ones when the teacher was busy. On the 7th day the building was a church, and whoever had a word to preach, preached it, and whoever could sing led the singing. And the settlement sat together in the pews the men had built, and were, for those hours, one thing. And every single Sunday, at first light, before anyone else was on the road, Della Roundtree walked up the rise with a key at her waist and unlocked the door. She lit the stove if it was cold. She set the room right. She swept the sill. On Saturdays it was Amos and Ludie who did the sweeping, the two of them with a broom too big for either, working the dust out the door and down the step, laughing at each other, so that on Sunday morning the floor was clean for everyone who came. The community loved her for it. They loved her the way you love the person who is always already there when you arrive, the one who has the fire lit and the door open. They loved her, and that is important, Because I do not want you to think this is a story about people who were born cruel. It is not. It is a story about people who forgot. Because the years went on and Fair Prospect grew and new families came. New wagons on the North Fork, new soddies going up on claims that had stood empty. And these new families had not been there for the raising. They had not carried the paper or swung the hammers or wept when the bell first rang. They came to a settlement that already had a church on a rise, a white building that had always, as far as they could see, simply been there. They did not know it had a beginning. They did not think buildings had beginnings. It was the church. It stood on the church's ground. That is how they said it. The church's ground. And here is the first thing I want you to notice. The thing nobody in Fair Prospect noticed at the time. Della still kept the only key. 3 years on, and every Sunday it was still Della who came up first and turned the lock, and nobody thought about why. Nobody wondered where the key lived the other 6 days. It hung at her waist, or on a nail in her soddy, and it was hers. The only one, because she was the one who had commissioned the lock and paid for it off the paper. But a key is a small thing. Nobody thought about it. File that away. Here is the second thing. The building sat on the Roundtree quarter, on the corner she had given free. Everyone had known that once. But 3 years is long enough for knowing to soften into a habit of speech, and folks had taken to calling it the church's ground, the church's rise, as if the church were a person who owned land. The new families never knew any different. The old families had simply stopped saying the true thing, because the easy thing came quicker to the mouth. The ground was hers. They said it was the church's. Nobody was lying. They had just forgotten. File that away too. And here is the third thing, the quietest of all. The district's own copy of the subscription list, the 41 names in Della's careful hand, the record of who had paid and who had pledged, and the freight on the bell, sat folded in the bottom of Della's trunk in the soddy, under the good tablecloth she used at Christmas. Nobody had asked for it in years. Nobody remembered it existed. It lay in the dark of the trunk, 41 names, waiting, the way a thing waits when it is true and no one has needed the truth for a while. File that away hardest of all. Because the day was coming when someone would need it very badly. The man who would bring that day was Alvah Prewitt. He had come to Fair Prospect 2 years after the raising, a white homesteader from Ohio by way of Missouri, a man with a good claim and a loud voice, and a way of speaking in meetings that made quieter people defer to him. He was not a bad man in the way a villain in a story is bad. He tithed. He mended his neighbor's fence when it fell. He carried a widow's coal in the winter. But he was a man who believed the world had an order to it, and that he could read that order, and that it was his business to keep it. And he had gotten it into his head, somewhere along the line, that he was one of the men who had built that church. He had not, of course. He had come 2 years late. But he had put in his time in the pews, and he had chaired a committee or two, and he had risen to senior trustee, and in his own mind those 3 years had made him a founder. He said it easily. Us that built this church. He never once, in all his time in Fair Prospect, read the deed to the ground it stood on. He never once asked to see the subscription list. Why would he? He knew who had built the church. He was one of them. He was sure of it the way a man is sure of the ground under his own feet, which is to say, he had never once looked down. It began, as these things do, with something small. There had gotten to be more families than pews. Some Sundays. And the question of who sat where had started to prick at people. And Prewitt, being a man who liked an order, took it upon himself to propose one. He raised it in a trustees' meeting first, plain and procedural. A seating order, he called it. The founding families to have the front pews, as was only fitting, and the newer families and the, well, he did not finish that sentence the first time, but everyone in the room heard the shape of the end of it. Because Prewitt's order was not really about how many pews there were. There were black families and white families in fair prospect, side by side on the claims, side by side in the pews, the way frontier need had thrown them together. And Prewitt's seating order, dressed up as respect for founders, meant to sort that out. Front for the founders, as he counted founders. Back for the rest. And the rest, as he counted them, had a color to it. He did not say the word. He did not have to. He said founding families, and he looked at the room while he said it, and everyone understood. There was a second to the motion. There is always a second. And a date was set, a Sunday 2 weeks off, when the whole membership would vote on it in open meeting, hands up, so it would be done proper, and no one could say it had been sneaked through. Prewitt was proud of that, the openness of it. He thought it made him fair. He thought a thing voted on in daylight could not be wrong. He was about to find out how wrong a thing could be even so. But not yet. Not for 2 weeks. Word went up and down the fork. There is going to be a vote on the seating. People took sides in the low way people take sides, over fences and at the well, not wanting to say too much out loud. Some were for it who you would not have guessed. Some were against it who had the most to lose by being against it. And Della heard of it the way she heard of everything, early and quiet, and she said nothing. She unlocked the door that Sunday and the next, as she always did. She swept the sill. She lit the stove. She sat with Amos and Ludie where she always sat. And she waited for the day they had set, because she was not a woman who spent herself on a fight before the fight had come. The day came. It was a bright cold Sunday in the early spring of 1881, the grass just going green at the roots, the river loud with melt. 40 members came, the most that had been inside those walls at once in a long while, because everyone knew there was to be a vote, and no one wanted to miss it. Della came up first, as ever, and turned the key, and lit the stove against the chill, and set the room right. And by the time the wagons came grinding up the rise, the building was warm and the door was open. Because she had opened it. They filled the pews. And after the singing, before the preaching, Alvah Prewitt stood up in the front of the room, in the building on the rise of Della Roundtree's claim, and he called the meeting to order for the vote. He was calm. He was even gentle about it, in his way. He said it was nothing against anyone. He said it was only right that the families who had built the church should sit at the front of it. And then he said the line, the one that would follow him the rest of his days, whether he knew it or not. The front pews are for the families that built this church. And he asked for the hands. You could feel the room go tight. 40 members watched the hands go up. Neighbors watched neighbors. Hands came up slow, some of them, and quick. Others, and some did not come up at all, and their owners looked at their laps. Prewitt counted. A man beside him counted with him. To keep it honest, that was the joke of it. To keep it honest. The vote carried. 22-19. One member, they realized after, had not voted at all, and no one ever learned who, and it did not matter, because 22-19 was a majority and the thing was passed. And then, it had to be done. That was the terrible part, the part Prewitt in his love of daylight had not quite reckoned with. A vote on paper is one thing. A vote made flesh, in front of the people it falls on, is another. Because now the seating order had to actually seat people. And the first family it fell to seat was the one right there in the third pew from the front, where they had sat every Sunday for 3 years. Della Roundtree and her 2 children. Prewitt did it himself. I will give him that much. He did not send another man to do it. He came down the aisle, in the building she had raised, and he stood at the end of her pew, and he put out his hand toward the back of the room, toward the last bench against the rear wall, and he indicated that the children were to move. Amos, 11 now, and Ludie, 8, the children who swept that floor on Saturdays. To the back bench. In front of everyone, so that the order would be seen to be kept from the very first Sunday. The room did not breathe. Ludie looked up at her mother, not understanding, only feeling. Amos understood, and his face did a thing a child's face should not have to do, going from a boy's face to something older and shut in the space of a breath. And every one of the 40 was looking at Della Roundtree to see what she would do. Because they all knew, whatever they had voted, they all knew whose pew this was, and whose floor, and whose rise, and whose bell in the gable overhead. Even the ones who had let themselves forget it knew it now. In the pit of them, watching, she did not raise her voice. She did not argue the vote. She did not stand up and tell them what I have just spent this whole time telling you, that the ground was hers and the building was hers and the list was in her trunk and the key was at her waist. She could have. Lord, she could have stood up in that pew and unmade Alvah Prewitt with a sentence. She said nothing. She did not sit down either. She rose, in her own good time, unhurried, and she took Ludie by one hand and Amos by the other, and she walked them not to the back bench, but out. Out the door she had unlocked that morning. Down the step her children had swept, and when the meeting was over, when the last of the 40 had filed out and climbed into their wagons, and gone down the rise still not quite meeting each other's eyes, Della came back up the step alone. She took the key from her waist. And she locked the door behind everyone, as she did every single week, because that was her task, and no vote had changed it. She locked the door of the building on her own ground, and she put the key back at her waist, and she walked down to her soddy, where her children were waiting, and she did not weep where they could see her. That was the wound. Now I will tell you what she did with it, and I am telling you now so you do not spend the next part of this story hoping for the wrong thing. She did not draft a lawsuit. She did not go to Kirwin and set a lawyer on them. She did not stand up the next Sunday and read the deed and shame the whole room, which she had every right in the world to do. She did not scheme, and she did not gloat, and she never once, from that day to the last day of this story, raised her voice to Alvah Prewitt or any of the 22. Hold on to that. Whatever you are expecting, it is quieter than that, and it is worse for them than that, and it does not come from her mouth at all. It comes from the record. But that is getting ahead. That week, the week between that Sunday and the next, Della did two things. The first she did alone, at night, at her table, by a single flame. She opened her trunk and she took out the good Christmas tablecloth and set it aside, and from underneath it she took the two papers that had lain in the dark all these years. The homestead entry, with the Kirwin stamp and her name written in it, Della Roundtree, 160 acres. And the subscription list. 41 names in her own careful hand, the cash and the labor, and near the bottom, in the same steady letters, the freight on the bell. She read them both slowly, all the way through, though she knew every word. She was not reminding herself. She was making sure. And then she folded them, and she did not put them back under the tablecloth. She put them somewhere closer to hand. The second thing she did with Amos, and she did it in the last light of a weekday evening, when the settlement was at its supper and the road was empty. She and the boy walked the 2 miles east, along the edge of her own claim, to the far corner where the first soddy still stood, the one she had built her first year, the one she still owned, on the low ground by the eastern line. It had good thick walls, and it had stood empty a while, but it was sound. She looked at it a long time. Amos did not ask her why. He was learning her way, which was to act first, and let the why show itself. Then, they walked back to the frame building on the rise, in the near dark, and Della unlocked it one more time, and the two of them went in, and they did the thing this whole story has been walking toward, without your quite knowing it. Up in the gable hung the bell. The 60-pound bell, freighted up from Leavenworth in 1879. The freight paid off the subscription in her own hand. Amos climbed up to it, because he was young and light and quick, and Della guided from below, and between the two of them, The boy above and the woman braced beneath, they worked that iron bell down off its mount. 60 pounds is a great deal for a woman and a boy of 11. They took it slow. They took it careful. They did not let it ring. They carried it out. They wrapped it in sacking so it could not speak, and they laid it in the little handcart, and Della locked the frame building behind her one more time, the empty gable dark against the last of the sky. And in the full dark, the two of them, the woman and the boy, wheeled that muffled bell the 2 miles east, along the edge of her claim, to the low ground and the old sod house on the eastern line. Nobody saw them go. Nobody on the fork of the Solomon knew the bell had moved. It hung now in the gable of a soddy 2 miles from where it had rung for 3 years, and its rope hung down inside a low sod room, and Della Roundtree looked at it there and said nothing at all about what she meant to do with it. Sunday was coming. The following Sunday, 6 days off, and then 5, and then fewer. On the rise, the frame building stood locked and warmless, and up in its gable, where the bell had hung since the raising, there was now only an empty mount and a rope tied off to nothing, though no one had reason yet to look up and see it. And 2 miles east, in a sod house on the low ground by the line, a 60-pound bell hung in the dark and waited for a hand to wake it. The congregation did not know. Alvah Prewitt did not know, sitting satisfied at his own supper table, certain the order had been kept and the world set right. The 22 did not know, and the 19 did not know. Amos knew, and Ludie half knew, and Della knew, and none of the 3 of them said a word to a living soul. All up and down the North Fork, families went about their week, and when they thought of Sunday at all they thought of it as they always had, the bell on the rise, the door that would be open because Della always opened it. They were right about one thing. On Sunday, at first light, before anyone else was on the road, a hand would take hold of a bell rope and pull, and the sound would go out across the grass the way it had for 3 years, and the families would hear it and turn toward it the way they always had. They were wrong about where it would come from. Sunday came the way Sundays come. Gray first, then gold along the low places where the river ran. The grass was wet. The air was still. And a little after first light, out on the eastern line of the Roundtree claim, a hand took hold of a rope in the dark of a sod room and pulled. The bell rang. It rang the way it had rung for 3 years. The same 60 pounds of iron, freighted up from Leavenworth in 1879, the same deep throat of it rolling out over the grass. Anyone who had lived on the North Fork of the Solomon that long knew that sound in their sleep. It meant the door was open. It meant Della had unlocked it, the way she always did. It meant come in. But it came from the wrong place. Out on the road, Coker heard it and pulled his team up short. He sat there with the lines slack in his hands and turned his head. His wife looked at him. The children in the wagon bed went quiet. The sound was not on the rise where it belonged. It was low, and it was east, and it was 2 miles off across the flat. "That ain't right," Coker said. He said it soft, the way a man says a thing he does not understand yet. Down the road a piece, the Osborne children stopped dead in the dirt. They had been running ahead the way children do, and they stopped with their bare feet in the cool dust and stood there listening, their heads cocked, because the bell was behind them now instead of in front of them. Old Mrs. Vane heard it from her doorway. She had buried a husband and 2 grown sons on that fork, and there was not much left in the world that could turn her head. This turned it. She stepped down off her stone and looked east, out to where the low ground was, and she said to no one at all, "Now that is the soddy. That is the old Roundtree soddy, sure as I'm standing here." And she was right. She was the first one on the whole fork to name it plain. So they turned. All up and down the road, wagons and walking families turned east instead of west, not because anyone had told them to. Because the bell told them to, and the bell was the thing they had followed for 3 years, and a body does not stop following a thing like that on the strength of one strange morning. They followed the sound. It took them off the rise and down toward the river and out along the eastern line, 2 miles, to a low-sod house on the flat ground with a rope hanging down through its gable and a bell swinging in the dawn. Alvah Prewitt did not turn. Alvah Prewitt drove straight up the rise to the frame building the way he had every Sunday for the 2 years he had lived on the Fork. He had come to Graham County from Ohio, by way of Missouri, and he had arrived 2 years after the raising, which is to say he had never once lifted a beam or carried a nail or set a stone of the place. He did not know that. He had forgotten it, if he ever knew it at all. To Alvah Prewitt, the frame building on the rise was the church, and the church was his. And the order of it was his to set right, and he had set it right the Sunday before with a vote of 22-19. He got down off his buggy in front of a locked door. There was no smoke. There was no warmth. There was no Della standing at the threshold with the key in her hand. He tried the door, and it did not give. He stepped back and looked up at the gable the way a man looks up when a thing is wrong overhead, and where the bell had hung since the raising there was nothing. Only the empty mount. Only a rope, tied off to itself, hanging slack against the boards, going nowhere. He stood a long moment in front of that. His people did not come. He waited, and the road up the rise stayed empty, and the only sound on the whole fork was the bell, low and steady, coming from the wrong direction, from 2 miles east from her ground. "Somebody has taken the bell," Alvah Prewitt said. And there was a heat coming up in him now, under the confusion, because he had a mind that ran to order, and a locked door and a stolen bell were the opposite of order. Somebody has broken in and taken the bell. He was wrong about that, but he had no way yet to know how wrong. He climbed back up on the buggy and turned the horse and drove down off the rise and out along the road to find the man whose whole business it was to settle questions of school and district. He drove to fetch the superintendent. He drove to report a theft. He did not know he was driving to fetch the one man in Graham County who would open a black book and read out loud the thing that Alvah Prewitt had never once thought to ask. Merritt Doane came a little after noon. He came by buggy, alone, with the district ledger under the seat, bound in black. He was the superintendent of public instruction for the whole county, and he had a great many districts to think about, and he had not wanted this one. He had heard enough on the drive out to know it was the ugly kind of trouble, the kind with pride in it, and he did not care for the ugly kind. But a district is a district, and a question had been put to him, and he was a man who answered questions the way the book told him to answer them. He drove up the rise first, because that was where Prewitt led him. He looked at the locked door and the empty gable, and he wrote nothing down yet. Then Prewitt pointed east to where the bell had been ringing all morning, and Doane turned the buggy and drove the 2 miles down toward the river. By the time he got there, the low ground in front of the soddy was full of wagons. They had come. Family after family, the ones who had followed the sound. They stood in the wet grass in front of the old sod house with their hats in their hands and their children beside them, and the bell hung quiet now in the gable above them because the ringing was done and the gathering was made. Della Roundtree stood in the doorway of the soddy. Amos stood at her right hand. Ludie stood at her left. She was not saying much. She did not have to. The people had come to her the way they came every Sunday, and if the house behind her was made of sod instead of milled lumber, not one of them seemed to find that strange enough to leave over. Alvah Prewitt got down off Doane's buggy and looked at all of them looking back at him, and something in his face began, for the first time, to be uncertain. "Mrs. Roundtree," Doane said. He took his hat off. He was a mannerly man. "There's a question been put to me. I'd as soon settle it plain and settle it once." "Then settle it," Della said. That was all. She did not raise her voice. She had not raised her voice the Sunday before, either, when they sent her children to the back bench, and she did not raise it now. Prewitt spoke first, because Prewitt was a man who spoke first. "The bell's been taken off the church," he said. "The door's been locked against the congregation. I'd call that plain enough, superintendent, that is church property, and this is a church matter, and I am senior trustee of it." Doan did not answer him right off. Doan reached under the seat of the buggy and brought out the black book and set it open on the seat, and the crowd went quiet, the way a crowd goes quiet when a thing is about to be read out that cannot be taken back. "Let's do it in order," Doan said. "First the ground." He put his finger on the page. "This is the entry for District Number 9. The meeting house on the rise, the frame building, stands on a quarter section. 160 acres. Entered at the land office at Kirwin, and the entry is filed and stamped, and the name on the entry, he looked up once at Prewitt, and then back down at the book, the name on the entry is Della Roundtree." He let that sit. "That building," Doan said, "the one that's locked this morning, the one you drove me up the rise to see. It sits on Mrs. Roundtree's homestead. It has sat on her homestead since the day it was raised. 3 years. Every Sunday. For 3 years, this congregation has met inside a house that stands on her entered ground." Nobody moved. A dozen heads turned toward Della and turned back. Mrs. Coker, who had been the first to come to the soddy door that morning, put her hand up over her mouth. Old Mrs. Vane, who had come up the rise on foot just to see this thing ruled, made a low sound in her throat that was not quite a word. Prewitt's mouth worked. "That's the land," he said. "Land's one thing. The church was built by the families. The lumber, the labor, I was coming to that," Doan said. "That's the second thing. The money." And here Della Roundtree turned and went into the soddy and came back out into the daylight with 2 papers in her hand. She did not wave them. She did not hold them up for the crowd. She put them into the superintendent's hand the way you hand a man a thing he asked for, and she stepped back, and she said nothing. Doan looked at the first paper. "This is the entry," he said. "The Kirwin stamp, hers." He set it down on the book. Then he looked at the second paper for a long moment, and the crowd waited, and the bell hung silent overhead. "This," Doan said, "is the subscription list." He held it a little higher, not to show off, but so the ones in the back could see there was writing on it. Close and full. 41 names, he said. 41. This is the paper that was carried door to door before the raising, when there was no meeting house on this whole fork, and folks put down what they'd give. Cash and pledged labor. It comes to $612 all told. And it is written in one hand, top to bottom. Her hand. He turned the paper over and turned it back, the way a man does when he is making sure of a thing. "The freight on that bell," Doan said, and he lifted his chin toward the gable of the soddy, toward the iron hanging quiet up there in the sod. "Freighted up from Leavenworth in the year 79. Somebody paid the freight on 60 pounds of iron to come up out of Leavenworth to the North Fork of the Solomon. It's here. It's wrote right here." He found the line with his finger, 19th name down. $2 and a day's labor, and the freight on the bell. Roundtree, Alvah Prewitt looked at the paper he could not read from where he stood, and he looked at the bell he had called stolen, and the heat went out of his face and left something underneath it that was worse than heat. He tried once more. He was not a stupid man, and he was not, in the whole of him, a cruel one, but he had built his standing on a thing that was not true, and a man does not set down a thing like that easy. "The building is the church," he said. His voice was lower now. "The building is the district. Whoever holds the building holds the school and the meeting both. That's the frame house on the rise, and the frame house is locked, and that's the end of it. Ground or no ground." For one beat it hung there. It was a real question, the way he put it. There was a locked frame building on the rise and there was a sod house on the flat, and a body might have thought the law would side with the milled lumber over the mud. Doan closed the book slow. "No," he said. "That's where you've got it backward, and you've had it backward a while, I expect." A district is not a building. I've ruled on this before and I'll rule on it again. A district is its enrolled families and the ground entered for it. It is the people, and it is the land under them. It is not one frame house that happens to have a roof on it. He looked out over the wet grass, over the wagons, over the families standing there with their hats in their hands. Count them, Doane said. Because I have to write a number in this book before I drive home, and the number is the families that make up District Number 9. And the families that make up District Number 9 are the ones standing on this ground right now, following that bell, not the empty house on the rise. This, and they counted. 11 families. They stood there in the daylight, and Doane went along them with his finger the way he had gone along the names in the book, and it came to 11. Exoduster families and white families, standing together in the same wet grass in front of the same sod door. Coker was there, who had pulled his team up short on the road and turned east. Mrs. Coker was there. Old Mrs. Vane had walked the 2 miles on her own 2 feet just to be counted in it. The Osborne children were there, who had stopped dead in the road at the wrong bell. 11, all told, and Doane wrote the number in the black book with the crowd watching him do it. 4 did not come. The narrator will not be cruel about it, because there was no cruelty in it, only the plain weight of what a body stands to lose. 4 families stayed back on the rise, or stayed home, and each of them had a reason tied fast to Alvah Prewitt. One carried store credit through him, and a winter is long, and a man does not spit in the well he means to drink from. One had a fence line that ran up against Prewitt's, and a fence is a peace between neighbors that is easy to break and hard to mend. One had a note at the bank with Prewitt's name signed under his own, and a co-signed note is a hand around the throat that only squeezes when you cross the man. And one, the plain truth of it, stayed back on the rise out of nothing but pride, because they had voted with the 22 the Sunday before, and to walk east now was to say out loud that they had been wrong, and there are men who would sooner lose the whole thing than say that. So it was 11, and not 15. Doane wrote 11. And that number, more than the ground and more than the money, was the truest ledger of what the church on the fork had really been all along. It named who had come for Della and who had come for the front pew. Then Doane climbed up on his buggy, and he did a thing that surprised the crowd. He took his hat off again, to Della, in front of all of them, in front of Prewitt. "Mrs. Roundtree," he said, "it's your ground, and it was your subscription, and it's your bell. I don't know that there was ever a question in it but the one nobody thought to ask. Good day to you," and he drove off east toward the county seat with the black book under the seat, and the ruling was made, and it could not be taken back. That left Alvah Prewitt. He did not follow the buggy, he did not get in it. He stood alone on the low ground with the crowd already turning away from him, back toward the soddy and the doorway and the woman in it, and there was nothing for him to be senior trustee of anymore. Nobody had struck him. Nobody had shamed him with a speech. Della Roundtree had not said one word to him the whole time. Not one. And that was the worst of it. He had been ruled, not argued. The record had done it. The ground and the list and the count had done it, and he had done it to himself 3 years back by walking into a house he never helped raise and calling it his. He walked the 2 miles back to the rise on his own 2 feet, and he stood inside the frame building for a while. It was cold in there. It was empty. The pews he had wanted to reserve for the founding families stood in rows in the gray light, and there was not one founding family in the whole county who would sit in them now, because the founding family had never been his, and never would be. And above him, the gable stood empty where the bell had hung. He looked up at the empty mount and the slack rope tied off to nothing. He stood in the middle of a building he had believed he owned, and he understood, all at once and all the way down, that he had never been anything in that room but a guest. A guest who had voted to send the host's children to the back bench. He did not say anything. There was no one to say it to. He went home. Now here is the last of it. The following week, Alvah Prewitt walked the 2 miles east again. He did not take the buggy. He walked it, the way a man walks a thing when he means it, with his hat in his hand the whole way, and he came down off the road, onto the low ground, and up to the sod house where the bell hung in the gable. Della was teaching. That is what the building was, 6 days out of 7, a schoolhouse, District Number 9, and inside it a dozen children sat at their letters, Amos among them and Ludie among them, and Della's voice came out through the open door, low and even, saying the sounds of the words for them to say back. Prewitt stopped at the door. He did not go in. He stood there, with his hat in his 2 hands, and he waited to be seen. She saw him. She came to the door. Behind her the children went quiet the way children do when a stranger is at the threshold. She looked at him standing there. The senior trustee who was senior trustee of nothing, the man from Ohio by way of Missouri who had arrived 2 years after the raising and voted to reserve the front pews. She could have said a great many things. She had earned the right to every one of them. She could have named the vote. She could have named the backbench. She could have named the 3 years she unlocked that door at dawn while he was still in Ohio, or the $612, or the freight on the bell. She said 4 words. You are welcome here. That was all. That was the whole of it. And Alvah Prewitt stood in the doorway of a sod house on another person's ground and was handed the one thing he had voted to deny 2 children the week before. A seat. A welcome. A place at the front of the room. It was the reward for the worthy and the fall of the arrogant in the same 4 words, out of the same mouth, in the same daylight the vote had been cast in. He did not stay. He nodded, the way a man nods when his throat will not work, and he put his hat back on, and he walked the 2 miles home. And he never told a soul in Graham County what she had said to him at that door. He carried those 4 words the rest of his life, and he carried them in silence, which is its own kind of answer. The years came on. The North Fork of the Solomon ran the way it always ran, gray in the first light and gold in the low places. Up on the rise, the frame building stood on Della Roundtree's 160 acres, and on Sundays it stood empty, its doors shut, its gable bare. It was a good building. Nobody tore it down. It just was not the church anymore. Because the church had never been the building, and now everybody on the fork knew it. 2 miles east, on the low ground by the line, the old sod house was full. Full 6 days a week with children at their letters, full on Sundays with families in from all over the fork, Exoduster and White together, and up in its gable the 60-pound bell hung and rang out at dawn the way it had rung for 3 years and would go on ringing. Della Roundtree unlocked the door every morning. She still held the only key. She had always held the only key. And the strangest thing, the thing that tells you the most, is what the county did about the vote. Nothing. There is not one line in one book in Graham County that says a vote was ever taken to seat a freedwoman's children at the back. It was never formally acknowledged. It never had to be. The record answered it without anyone ever having to write it down, one plain paragraph about a district and its ground and its enrolled families, and not a word about the pews or the 22 or the 19. The record said what Della never had to claim. Because a house is not the same thing as the people who carried it. You can vote on who sits in the front of a house. You cannot vote on who owns the ground it stands on, or who paid the freight on the bell, or whose hand turns the key at dawn. Alvah Prewitt learned that standing in an empty building. It cost him everything he thought he had. It cost Della Roundtree nothing but a week's quiet. Because she had known who she was the whole time. She was never the guest. She was the one who said, at her own door, to the man who had forgotten it, "You are welcome here." If you followed this story all the way east, to the low ground and the sod gable and the bell that rang from the wrong direction, do one thing for me before you go. Comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Della stayed in Fair Prospect until 1894, when Amos was old enough to file his own entry on the adjoining quarter, and Ludie had finished every grade the Saudi school could offer her, and gone east to Topeka for the rest. By then, the frame building on the rise had weathered past holding services in winter, and the congregation that still met there, smaller every year. The Prewitt sons, having drifted toward Kirwin, quietly began borrowing the sod schoolhouse on Sundays when Della permitted it, which she always did, because that was the kind of woman she was. Alvah Prewitt died in the winter of 1889. He is buried in the Graham County Cemetery outside Hill City under a stone that says devoted husband and father and does not mention the church he thought he built. His widow sold the homestead claim the following spring. The record at Kirwin shows it transferred clean. Merritt Doane served as Graham County Superintendent of Public Instruction until 1891. In his final report, filed with the state, he listed District No. 9 as among the highest-performing rural districts in the county for reading and arithmetic. He named no one. The numbers spoke clearly enough. Of the 11 who walked the road east that Sunday morning, 7 are still traceable in the county records, homestead entries renewed, children enrolled in the district roster, names on the tax rolls through the end of the century. 4 of them are exoduster families whose grandchildren's grandchildren are in Kansas still. 3 are white families who had no particular courage in mind when they followed the bell, only that it rang from the right direction, and they were already on the road. Of the 4 who stayed, the record is quieter, the way records are when people would rather not be found in them. 1 lost the store credit anyway, 2 years later, when the merchant Prewitt had vouched for closed his account. The fence line is still there if you know where to look. The mortgage note was paid off finally in 1896. None of the 4 ever formally acknowledged what they had weighed that morning against 11 families walking east in the cold light, and none of them had to, because the record does not require confession. It only requires time. Amos Roundtree taught school in Graham County for 31 years. He used his mother's subscription list as a teaching document, not as a grievance, but as arithmetic. 41 names. $612. 1 frame building on a quarter section entered in his mother's name at the Kirwin land office. He would put the list on the desk and ask his students to do the sums, and when they had finished, he would ask them one question: whose building is this? And they always got it right, because the numbers were right there, plain as anything, and numbers do not argue. Ludie Roundtree became a school teacher in Topeka. She named her first classroom the Della Roundtree Reading Room, though the school administration declined to put it on the door, and so she put it in her own hand on a card above the chalkboard. And it stayed there the 30 years she taught in that room, and nobody ever took it down. Della herself left no memoir, no letter published, no interview on record. What she left was the homestead entry, the subscription list in her trunk, the 60-pound bell in the sod gable, and one sentence that a man walked 2 miles in November cold to hear and then spent the rest of his life not repeating. Because to repeat it would have required explaining why he needed to be told it at all. You are welcome here. 4 words, the whole weight of 3 years, a land entry, 41 names, $612, a vote carried 22-19, and a bell rung from the wrong direction, and she spent none of it. She said 4 words, and unlocked the door, and went back to teaching. That is the kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not have to. It already has the key.